Amen. You can turn to Ruth chapter 1, and we're going to pick up at verse 17. Ruth chapter 1, and we'll pick up at verse 17. Really, we'll pick up with verse 16 in this particular section. Ruth and Naomi are have been at a crossroads, remember? Ruth had been encouraged to go home. What has she decided to do? She's going to stay. She's not going home. And you remember we ended last week right at verse 16 and verse 17, where Ruth said, if you'll turn back to verse 16, she says, entreat me not to leave thee. Don't beg me anymore to leave. She says, entreat me not to return from following after thee. Don't beg me to turn back around after I follow you back home. For whether thou goest, I will go. Whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. And thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God. Ruth is telling Naomi here that she is going to stay with the one true living God. Now, they've all been through tragedy. And as we pick up in verse 17, we see the implication she's making here. Where thou die, I will die. And there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part me, or thee and me. What is the resolve behind Ruth? Why is she staying? Why is she staying? Why didn't she go home? She loved Naomi. I think that's motivation number one. When you love someone, what are you going to do? You're going to stay with them. You're going to stay. You're going to do everything you can. You're going to fight. You're going to dig. You're going to do everything you can to be there. I think that's great, number one. Number two, why is she not leaving? Why is she staying with Naomi? It's at the latter part of verse 16. Who else is she not leaving? God. If she goes back to her home in Moab, what gods are they serving there? Idols. That's the easiest way. Pagan gods. And if she goes back, who is she not going to have the opportunity with someone else or with a connection to someone else to not stand alone? See, if she goes back, she'll stand alone in serving God, won't she? Most likely. That's the idea. So here she says, wherever you go, I go. No matter what you do. I will follow after you. And now let's add verse 18 to our mind to conclude our thoughts from last week. Verse 18, here she says to Naomi, or here Naomi is recording in her mind, when she saw that she was steadfast-minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. What has Naomi finally decided? There's nothing I can do to stop this. And this brings us into the final lesson we were putting into this particular section. There are many occasions in life where there is nothing that we can do about the actions of others. There are many occasions in life where we can do nothing about the actions of others. Now, it just happens to be that this is a good action, isn't it? I believe this is the right thing for Ruth, don't you? To stay with God, to stay with Naomi. I think this is the right thing to do. Now, in the same turn of that discussion, are there also negative things people do that are outside of our control? Oh, yeah. And this is one of those lessons that we're learning in the book of Ruth. Sometimes, let me rephrase that, all the time, other people are out of our control. And we struggle with that, don't we? Because just like Naomi, we want others to do the best, don't we? We do. Thus, I believe, Naomi felt she was giving her the best advice she could in life, and she said, go home. It's an intriguing thing. Would it have been better for Ruth to go home or to stay with Naomi and go back to God's land? Which was the better choice? I think staying with her was the better choice, don't you? So would we say that Naomi was wrong? Yeah.
Was Naomi possibly scared or worried about going home alone?
Don't know. I would say with the resolve of Naomi, she was not scared to go home. She had heard that good report that home was going well. Well, I've pondered that. I'll tell you, I don't think that there's enough in the text to tell us she had family at home or didn't. We know that she got a report back from home that things were okay and that she could come back. Yes, she was. Yes, she was. Not only had she left a pagan society, but she had also vowed off a pagan society. And what she's telling Naomi here, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God. And I don't know if you noticed this back in this particular passage, but look at the way God is represented in verse 16. What do you notice about the three letters G-O-D that are repeated twice at the end of verse 16? They're big G. Now notice in the Old Testament you have big G and little g. What does that refer to? Pagan gods, idols, things that people put in front of the Almighty God. That's the type of nature we're talking about. So what has Ruth said? What God is she going to serve? True God. The true God. So see how much she's been influenced? So here they're on their way. Naomi has finally decided this is a good thing. So as you begin to enter into verse 19, we're going to start our return to Judah. And verse 19 reads this way, so they too went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them. And they said, now listen to this, is this Naomi? We don't really know what the travel looked like and the scenes of going from the city they were in to where they were going to Bethlehem. We know it took some time. We know the travel would have been weary. We sometimes get tired riding in the car. I bet you we can't imagine that kind of travel tired, can we? So think about this. As they get back, what happens to Naomi? What happens to Naomi? She has lost her husband and her son. She's now back in the city in which she originally left. What happens to her when she gets to the city?
She meets a cousin, doesn't she?
Well, we'll get to, yeah, we're going to get to Boaz soon. He's not far off. Do what? She's going to become bitter. What happens in verse 19? She gets to the gate of the city. What do the people say? There we go. They recognized her. I find that to be important. And I want to ask us this question of this community. If we had to leave it and then return it sometime, would we be recognized? It's an interesting question, isn't it? It's been at least 10 years. We're going to call that our minimum. At least 10 years. And when she gets to the gate of the city, verse 19, it gives us the idea that people were moved about them. It caused a stir. And this question was asked, is this Naomi? Naomi's friends and Naomi's fellow citizens were obviously astonished at her return. I would suggest that they had probably heard that her husband and her children had passed away. We don't think of news traveling as fast in the time we're reading of, but most likely it traveled almost just as fast as it does today. Now, obviously, they could not send a text message around the world instantly, but news still traveled just as much. So you hit verse 20 and 21, and she said unto them, call me not Naomi. Here's where we start to see Mara. Call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me? All right. She made it to the gate. What was the scenes of her entering in the city? Everybody recognized her. Would you say that's positive? I think that's very positive. It's been 10 or more years, probably in the 10 to 15, maybe if you long date it, 10 to 20 years. She gets back to the city. She's recognized, very positive. Isn't it nice when you go somewhere where you used to live or maybe where you used to have acquaintances and someone comes up and recognizes you? Isn't that a good occasion? Yeah. But listen to her reaction. Why do you call me Naomi? This is the bitterness setting in. The bitterness. What is bitterness? That's what Mara means, bitter. What is bitterness? How would we define it?
Bad taste.
That's a very good definition of it. Probably the best definition. She has a bad taste in her mouth. Now let's just review for just a minute. And I love how she states it in the end of this. Verse 21, look at the first phrase. I went out full. What does she mean by that? When I left Bethlehem, because of the famine, I went out full. She had a husband. She had 2 children. She went out full. And that should tell us something. She never has mentioned her possessions so far in this entire section we've been studying. We're 21 verses in, and what has Naomi not mentioned? Physical possessions. But what has she mentioned? Yeah. She's mentioned she's got nothing now, which gives us the reference of what she valued in life. Family. Family, yeah, there you go. I'm glad you added that one to it. Family. Now notice who she has not left yet. God. She's not left God yet. She's bitter, but she has not left Him yet. So she says, I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Yes, we may. Yeah, we do. You know, Naomi has faced reality in asserting her present condition. She had gone out full, she had come back empty. She sees the Lord's hand in her affairs, and she believes that God had allowed these afflictions to come onto her family. Perhaps, maybe she believes this is due to her leaving the city in which God's people were dwelling to live among the people of which were stooped in idolatry. But now she sees it that God has brought her back home. However, she says, I've been brought back home empty. Empty. Now, if you go back up to verse 20, before she ever tells anyone what she's talking about, she renames herself. Why would she rename herself?
Naomi means pleasant.
That's right. At one time, she was a very pleasant person to be around. You ever met a pleasant person to be around? You would probably say it's quite pleasant, wouldn't you? Very enjoyable. How does she see herself now? Opposite of pleasant. Bitter. Mara, bitter. Empty. I think that's a really good also definition to go along with Mara. It means bitter, but I think also in that bitterness there's emptiness. Have you ever felt empty? Most likely every one of us sitting in this room has felt empty or bitter or...
I think empty would come first.
Yeah, I think so too. I think she felt empty first. Remember, she left full. Empty happened before she came home. I think you're right.
She may have verbalized that, and she may have felt that, but she didn't show that.
Exactly. To this point, has she showed this? I'll come back to that. Has she showed this yet? No. Who has she had to deal with? Who are the 2 people she was dealing with? Obviously, one is Ruth. Who's the second one? Yeah, Orpah. She went home to her Moab family. Ruth is still with her. And I want to beg this question. If you go back, verse 18, then she left speaking unto her. She's on her way to Bethlehem. How quiet was that travel? How quiet? Well, now, we don't know. But how quiet does it seem that travel was? She was conversating with... It was a good distance. She was conversating with Ruth in the beginning, begging her to go home, and when she saw that it was to no avail, she left speaking her and traveled.
But that may mean that she just left speaking to her
About that issue. It very well could, and I won't suggest that it only means one thing. I don't suggest that at all. But how quiet do you think that travel could have been? Especially with the definition that happens now in verse 20 and 21. she's now empty. And it seems that as she travels on this road, the more she travels, the more empty she feels, because where is she supposed to be going? Home. What makes up a home? Kinfolks, family. Who's she taking with her? Ruth. That's all she has left.
I wonder if Naomi often thought about, why are you ignoring me?
Maybe. Maybe. But I don't know. I think she does. It seems that she does in chapter 1, certainly in the way she describes Ruth, in the way she's putting Ruth first. It seems very much that she describes her that way, but it also seems at the same time, at certain points in life, she doesn't see her that way.
Naomi was desperate. She not only was playing herself, but
Yeah.
the daughter-in-law.
That's right. She has an extra burden. She has an extra burden to bear.
Maybe she doesn't know what's waiting for her at home. How she gonna support herself.
I think so. And I think that played into her decision to tell her, go back home. You have sustainability here. You can still follow God here. Go home. Maybe that's what she was saying. That's right. That's right. All of this has to do, and I'm glad you brought that back up. We talked about it the first class we started, this being the third. If the book of Ruth didn't exist, would we be here? Would the lineage of Christ be complete? No, we wouldn't be here. Without Christ, I don't think either of us, any of us, would be in this type of assembly, would we? Without Christ, we would not have a New Testament. That's right. There's a plan being put in place here, and I find it so impressive. So here she is. She's bitter, and even in these difficulties, here's what we're learning. Naomi is still blessed.
Will take care of it.
God's going to take care of this. God's going to take care of all of things. And this is one of my favorite phrases. For Naomi, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be just fine. So look at verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So here they are. They've officially arrived. And here's what's impressive to me. They've arrived at opportune time. They've arrived at a harvest, which means there is work to be done. There are things that can be doing. The barley harvest was just the beginning. She had faced hardship in the country just as Abraham had faced in the problems in Egypt, and Lot had faced in the problems of Sodom. But now she was back where she belonged. Now, pause for a minute because we're going to have more to say about this verse. And I think there's some application to the Christian here. An application to the Christian, the follower of God. Where does the Christian belong? Okay, I think that can be a very appropriate answer. But let's draw this down to more specific. Where do we belong? With our Christian family. I'm going to merge these two answers together. With our Christian family. Where do we survive and thrive the best? With like-minded people. With the people who are going to the same place that we're supposed to be going. Isn't that right? Is anyone here not trying to go to heaven? When you ask it backwards, it makes sense, doesn't it? Every person in this room is working on their lives so they can be with God for eternity, to be with God. That's why I said I think that's a very appropriate answer. That was a very appropriate answer. That's the long-term goal. But we do our best. We are our best when we are together. Now here she's back with her original people. She's back where she can be at her best. And her heart must have experienced great lift as the events of the next few weeks are going to unfold. You know, the barley harvest usually occurred about April, and it was right there in that scene just before the harvest. So as we move into chapter 2, here's what's happened. Naomi, due to a famine, left Bethlehem, ended up in the Moab region. Her husband dies, her 2 sons die. She sends Orpah home Ruth continues with her. She makes her way back to Bethlehem, and she calls herself empty and bitter Mara. And it's the harvest season. That's what's happened so far in quick review as we hit chapter 2, verse 1. Now listen to chapter 2, verse 1, because we mentioned this just a moment ago. Here's a man we're going to meet. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Chapter 1 detailed some of Naomi's experiences in a far country. And chapter 2 provides some information about the events in her own land. Ruth and Naomi now were widows. And from the human point of view, these two ladies had a small hope of the future. But with God's care, they had a great door of opportunity, didn't they? And that's true for every one of us in God's care. Now, Boaz, let's get to him. He was a kinsman of Elimelech, and Naomi's husband is dead, and now he's being introduced. In this scene, he was a descendant of Rahab the harlot of Jericho who married into Israel. If human wisdom and prejudice had settled into this bloodline of the Messiah, Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth would have been excluded. This is God's plan, remember. Now, Boaz is interesting to us. What had just happened in Bethlehem the last 10 years? Why did Naomi and her husband leave? Famine. How is Boaz described? A man of great wealth. Now, yes. A mighty man of wealth. It's interesting to me that this is Boaz, isn't it, to you? Ruth's on her way home, and she just happens to have a family member who's a mighty man of wealth. What does that kind of scream at you?
And he knows somebody.
Yeah, and he knows all these? What does that kind of scream at you? Well, yes, it does. It does scream that to us. But I think in the context of what we're studying about with Ruth and Naomi, God's providence. God's providence. Now, I'm a longtime advocate of this. I don't believe Ruth and Naomi looked and said, there's Boaz, isn't God providential toward us? I don't think they recognized this at the moment they're in. And thus I say that to us. We oftentimes claim the providence of God. I just want us to be careful in the way we do things, in the way we claim things. But here it seems to be that the providence of God, the hand of God was with her, and here's Boaz. Now, as we enter into verse 2, notice what happens. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. Now, under the Mosaic law, certain provisions were enacted to help the poor. It's interesting to me that even under God's law, there were certain enactions made to help the poor. But notice this. What did the poor have to go do to get their help? Okay. I think you and I can say this aptly, and we're not going to say much about this. I think it's 100% right to help the poor. Don't you? But at the same time, I understand the principle that's found in Scripture that I've got to get up and do something worthy of my help. Now, I don't say that to be mean. I certainly don't say that to be hard-hearted. But this is the system we're looking at here, and this is God's system in place, the Mosaic law. Now, landowners were not to gather the crops right up to the very edge of their fields or in the corners, and they were not to send reapers to the same field a second time. In other words, they were providing for those that needed help. This provision of the law is the background for the events that we're about to unfold. And they're going to glean from this, and I love what Ruth says. Whose sight I shall find grace. When we often see grace in the New Testament or the Old Testament, who is it usually coming from? God. Grace generally inside of Scripture comes from God. But in this occasion, who is grace coming from? Boaz, specifically, fellow man. think we're learning a lesson here about grace, don't you? We have to be a grace-giving people. Now, Boaz had to set plans in place to prepare for these corners, these edges, and these second not reapings of the harvest, didn't he? Did he have to prepare? Of course he did. Most likely, being a wealthy man, most likely had a good amount of land, so he had quite a bit to prepare. So here we see in verse 3, here she comes, and she went. I love Ruth and Naomi. What does Ruth do before she goes out into the field? She talks to Naomi, doesn't she? Remember verse 2? Let me go, Ruth says. Why does Ruth say that? She's younger. I like to call Ruth at this point level-headed because she sees the opportunity. Does Naomi need to be in that field? Probably not. Probably not. Who could be in that field? Ruth. And who had to recognize it? Ruth. So Ruth goes to Naomi, and it's a tender, it's a thinking Ruth. I'll go to the field. I love the implication of this. So Naomi says, go, my daughter, in verse 3, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Pause for a minute. Let's not read any further. When did Ruth go to the field? The reapers. She went while the workers were already there. That way, when it was her time, what was she? Prepared. We see not only a thinking Ruth in verse 2, but we see a prepared Ruth in verse 3. I think this is a principle that we all need to apply to our lives a little bit more. When it's time to do something, where should we be? Where we're needed. Ruth was needed in that field after the reapers, because that was the time for her to glean in this field. So continue on. And her hap was too light on the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. So the field Ruth selected belonged to Boaz. And from her viewpoint, it was a chance that she happened to pick from the field of Elimelech's kinsman. The hand of God's providence is observable in this particular section. Now add verse 4 to this, because 3 and 4 are going to be connected together. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless thee. Boaz is a businessman, right? I think the answer is yes. We may call him this way. Boaz is a farmer. I think that's a way to look at it. But in the ultimate scenes of things, Boaz is the businessman. He's making the decisions. He's sending people to the field. He's making the preparations. Boaz comes to the reapers. What's Boaz tell the reapers? Do what? Yeah, he's going to get to that. But look at verse 4. How does he introduce himself into the situation? The Lord be with you. Now, I know we don't talk like this anymore, but I think that's part of the problem. Don't you? First thing Boaz says, Lord be with you. Notice how they respond to him. I find this impressive. They instinctively answered him back, the Lord bless thee. Who was the priority of the reapers and the businessman? The Lord. The Lord. Now, I'm not saying when we greet each other and we don't say anything about the Lord that that's not our priority. It's not what I'm saying. But look at their priorities. They're already prepared for the gleanings in the field, the reaping in the field, the leaving of the corners and the edges. They followed God's commandments. When they met each other, what did they do? They greeted each other in the Lord's name. I find that to be absolutely impressive. Not only that, I find this to be impressive of Boaz. Not only is God in the priority of his life, but his workers are in the priority of his life. There's a difference between a leader and a dictator. There's a difference between a leader and a dictator. That's right. We'll work harder for the leader. That's right. That's right. Won't be talking about it behind his back. Won't be standing there taking your extra break that you didn't get. Yeah. It's impressive to me. He goes right up to the reapers. He had no problem doing that. And it tells me most likely they were on a name-to-name basis. That's right. He was, and I think this is a great characteristic of leadership, he was thankful. Now, he was paying them, which would also show his thanksgiving to them, but he not only paid them, he had association with them. That's the difference between a dictator and an actual leader, a leader of servanthood. He comes right up to them and spends time with these people. Now, who is in this field? Ruth. Ruth. Look at verse 5. Then said Boaz unto his servants that was set over to the reapers, whose damsel is this? What's Boaz saying? Who's that? Who is this that I'm seeing inside of this field? How many owners, it's another characteristic of Boaz, how many owners of a business or a field or some kind of organization would come in and see the poor and lowly and be concerned about them? Does that happen at Walmart? Does that happen in stores across our nation? How many owners are going to spend time looking at the poor in their vicinity? Not many. He is the owner of this field. He is the in-charge man. But Boaz took notice to Ruth.
He came out as the owner himself instead of having a manager.
That's right. I love that about him. I do. I love that about him. But Boaz is, if you want to read about a management position or you want to read about leadership, study Boaz alone. And just impressive Boaz.
Boaz, was he kin to
With Naomi?
Naomi?
Yes. Yeah, Naomi and Boaz have a kinship. Remember that. But remember who is not there? Naomi. It's Ruth. It's the poor Moabite woman. It's the poor foreigner. I find that impressive, especially in the context of our country right now. That's right. Well, this is what he noticed. He did not recognize her. He did not recognize her. So he is inquiring about her. He's inquiring about her condition. Now notice verse 6 and 7 because these are tied together. Let me make sure I haven't run out of time here. Oh, we got plenty of time. Good. Verse 6 and 7, and the servant was set over the reapers, answered and said, it is the Moabitess damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, isn't that interesting? And she said, she was ready. I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and hath continued even from the morning until now. And she tarried a little in the house. We're going to learn about Boaz. We're going to learn about Ruth. We're going to learn about the masters of the field. Boaz comes to the master of the field, the man who's set over this task for the day. Who is she? Yes, Ruth was an immigrant. Yeah, Ruth was an immigrant. Keep that into your minds. Who else noticed Ruth? The servants, the reapers. And they were in enough connection with Ruth that they knew where she was from, Moab. They knew her situation. She was in poverty. That's right. They spent some time together with her. Now, they didn't have to do that. They had a task to do. They had a job to finish. But what did they do? They took the time to see the decency in others. That's something our country, I believe, is lost. Our world in a whole is lost. We've lost the sense of just walking up and saying, how are you? How are you? Now, that's what we're looking at here.
She might have been beautiful.
It's very possible. It's very possible. Now, I won't dispute that. She may have been a very beautiful woman. Maybe so. Maybe so.
I think the reapers may have told him the situation so he knew her heart.
I think so too. I also think that. And that's why I said just a minute ago, I think we've lost this connection. They wanted to know the heart of Ruth. And I think that's right, Steve. And thus they tell Boaz, and look at what they told him. She came to us and says, let me glean the corners. Now this is what we're learning about Ruth. Ruth knew, probably through Naomi, that she could go do this. She goes to the field. She just doesn't start doing it, does she? What does she do? She asks. Haven't we lost that in our society too? Yeah. Boaz is going to show his compassion, which he's already done. He has complied to God's law. Look at what happens as we continue in verse 8. And then said Boaz unto Ruth, harvest not, my daughter. Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thy eyes be on the field that they do reap. And go thou after them, and have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou arisest, go up to the vessels and drink of that which the younger men have drawn. Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, why have I found grace in thy eyes, that thou should take us knowledge of me, seeing I'm a stranger? What's Boaz say? Sweetheart, you take it easy. You go over there and you get some of the water that the young men drew out for the young maidens. I'll charge that no one touches you. I'll take care of you, and you follow after the young maidens. The heart of Boaz. He didn't question it. He didn't get aggravated at it. He didn't bat an eye at her. What did he do? He welcomed her in. He welcomed her in. Now, I want to connect a thought back to something that's already happened. Here's the question. We have just a few minutes to answer this. Middle of verse 10, why have I found grace in thy eyes? What did she say when she left to go in verse 2? I'll go glean to see if I can find grace in someone's eyes. Verse 10, to Boaz himself, why have I found grace in your eyes? What did she seek after to find? Grace. What has she found? Grace. Now, as we prepare ourselves for next week, we will pick up here in this particular section, and we will make our way starting with verse 11. Boaz is going to respond to Ruth, and we'll pick up with her, and then we're going to get into the section beginning at verse 14 where Boaz is going to invite and give her some more instructions. So read the rest of chapter 2, and we'll pick up with it next Sunday morning. Thank you for your attention and your comments in class today. Thank you.